Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I am Simon.
I'm Martin.
And today we are talking to Dr. Matthias Krings. Matthias is a founding partner of Catenion, a management consulting firm specialized in science-driven strategy for biopharma. So Martin, what can our listeners look forward to in this episode?
Today we will try to do something fun, and that is that together with Matthias, we will try to create a playbook on how to create a perfect biopharma company. We will look into how to better link corporate and portfolio strategy and how to conduct better R&D risk assessment in the pipelines. Since Matthias is a true consulting veteran, he will also share with us his decision-making insights and how to do better decision-making in biotech and pharma. After the interview with Matthias, Simon and I will go over our reflections and takeaways. And as always, all views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers. Now, please welcome Dr. Matthias Krings.
Welcome, Matthias. It's great to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit about your bio?
Sure, happy to do that. My background is molecular biology. I have a degree in the area of human evolution and molecular evolution from the University of Munich. Then after a short postdoc, I decided, let's go to the dark side and become a consultant. I started out in Mercer Management Consulting, which is now by reverse takeover Oliver Wyman. Met two of my partners there, went on to Theron, small Anglo-German consultancy where we jointly set up a pharmaceutical practice in terms of team, client, intellectual capital. And then a little more than 21 years ago, we decided let's do our own thing and co-founded Catenion with them. And here we are.
That's super interesting. And I couldn't help notice on your bio on Catenion, the website, that you've done a quite interesting PhD.
Yeah. Thanks for prompting that one. Yes, I had a nice reminder of my academic days 2 years ago when Svante Pääbo, my PhD supervisor, got the Nobel Prize. And the reminder was even stronger when I looked into the press release that came with it, where they cited my Cell paper of back in the days in first place in the papers listed.
So Catenion is, I think the first lines you have on the webpage is like science-driven strategy for biopharma.
Indeed, yeah. One of the ideas of founding this company was, and that was in the early 2000s, it was the heyday of personalized medicine. Everybody thought, or at least we thought, it was around the corner, and within 5 years there would be a companion diagnostic for every drug. I think we got the timing wrong. It's still not the case. And at the same time, over the past 20 years, the use of biomarkers and diagnostics, patient stratification, etc., has advanced significantly. So I think the theme is still alive, very much so, but it hasn't permeated every part of pharmaceutical drug development or use.
So Matthias, we're going to try something new today in this episode, something we haven't done before with the previous guests, and that is we are going to try to build a perfect biopharma company. We need to have some ground rules here. So let's just imagine that we don't start entirely from scratch, but that we have already a biotech going or an average mid-size pharma company with some products all in the pipeline. They have some products already on the market. And now we have a goal to build a perfect company. So what would be the first thing you would look at?
Is it a private company that we're running or is it a public one? I would want to check in briefly on values and beliefs, especially private companies do that a lot. Why are we in business? And you can come up with different types of answers, such as we want to help patients, or we want to make money, or we want to be the perfect employer. This will influence what goals you're setting yourself and the company. And the goals and objectives is really the next thing. What do you want to achieve? What kind of company do you want to be? And biotech companies often have to ask themselves that. Do we want to be a platform company, a technology company, fee for service? Or do we want to be a drug company or a combination thereof? And these are simple questions, but answering them can be challenging and needs to be taken serious. So building the perfect company would include some of these elements. And then, of course, the question would be where to play, where do you want to place the focus, what therapy areas, if you're a larger company, if it's more than one, and within each of the therapy areas, which indications do you want to pursue? And how you select those indications and therapeutic areas can also be guided, again, by the values and beliefs. Yeah? If you started out by saying you wanted to help patients primarily, then maybe you start with where's the unmet medical need the highest. If you're primarily in business to make money, then you would perhaps look at where is the commercial opportunity the largest.
Can I ask, Matthias, because now you actually went into two different directions, right? One is the core beliefs, or what are we trying to achieve? And then, of course, the focus area. But maybe let's try to untangle them a little bit. If you look at a traditional or average pharma company, where do they tend to struggle the most? Is it already on the core belief section? Or is it that, okay, they probably have a good core belief, but then they don't really know what to do about it. They don't choose the right focus areas.
It is this question how to win. Suppose you have identified all that and you have your therapy areas and your indications selected. Then you might want to ask yourself, what part of the value chain do we want to cover in-house or partnering modalities, etc. And where do we have the greatest expertise? Where can we truly differentiate? And this is a prerequisite to one of the most important ingredients, which is the focus. Where do we want to lay the focus of the portfolio? And again, that within a TA can come down to very few indications at the core of your disease map.
That's a very clear answer. And so, Matthias, speaking of strategies, what do you see the biotech and pharma companies struggling with the most?
I think there are two things when it comes to this. One is managing the portfolio in a way that is consistent with the strategy, and to do that, how to set up the portfolio management. And managing the portfolio means adhering to the focus that was set by selecting certain indications, stringent assessment for fair comparison. And I'd like to emphasize, while we often hear it, you can't compare apples and oranges. I think you have to. Comparing apples to apples is not good enough in pharma R&D. And these are some of the goals in executing the strategy.
So, Matthias, does it happen often that you see a company presenting their strategy and then you think to yourself that this is not really a strategy, it doesn't meet the requirements of one? Perhaps it is more like an uncoordinated plan that will be hard to implement?
We see that from time to time. I mean, by and large, over the past 20 plus years, strategies have become better. Portfolio management has become better in executing it. But what we still often see is the confusion of the objective, the goal, and the strategy. Let me use an analogy like traveling to Rome. You want to start with the objective. Why do you even want to go to Rome? Maybe you want to see works of Michelangelo, but you could also see that elsewhere. But if you want to see the Sistine Chapel, you need to go to Rome if you want to see it live. And the strategy is, how do you get there? Do you want to do other things on the way? Then maybe you want to do a stopover, and it will determine what means of transport you're using. And similarly in pharma R&D, how much do you want to do in-house? What part of the value chain do you want to cover? What of your portfolio and your pipeline should be grown organically, and what part should be in-licensed and sourced externally or through business development, licensing, BD&L, or through strategic partnerships? And this is something that is strategic and is still in part determined by how you want to achieve the goal. That group of topics is sometimes confused.
Absolutely. And I think this is something that companies would traditionally, hopefully, got answered through their strategy process.
Well, again, ideally, I would suggest to start with the objective and the goal. And there's a process then that we refer to as disease mapping. And many companies are doing something similar under a different name. But it really starts with picking your therapeutic areas and indications. So coming back to the perfect pharma company that we had started already and now want to make perfect is, do we want to maintain the therapeutic areas that we're working in? And what about the indications? Are some of the indications that we used to focus on in the past 5 or 10 years, have they been served so well by the industry that the unmet medical need is not so high anymore? Then maybe we should pick a few different ones and look into where does it make sense to engage now in discovery and research, such that in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, we will be a significant player that can make a contribution to dealing with that disease. So that's picking the indications. And if you think of such an approach as delivering a bullseye, a target with a core, highest number of points, that can be a handful of indications in that therapy area. And outside of that would be a ring of adjacent indications, outside of which could be a ring of watch and wait indications, and outside of that, white space. So how is this relevant in guiding the operations of the company? Well, it is relevant because it can set direction for the effort that research is undergoing and also what BD&L is looking for. And it's also, in a way, a handshake between very distant parts of the organization, between discovery and research on the one hand, who want to do science, employ technology and be at the cutting edge of that, and the commercial functions that are also utterly aware of we're also going to have to make a dime with the product we're bringing to the market. So it's essentially a handshake suggesting that, okay, research and discovery start in places of the disease biology space where the science can lead you to the core indications. And if that works and the science leads you there, that's fine. True to the mantra, follow the science, it may also lead you elsewhere. If it leads you to adjacent indications on the next ring, you may have to have a discussion about resource availability, prioritization, and if it's still interesting, you might want to out-license it. If the science leads you to watch and wait, then you may want to ask the question, is the time now to engage, or is it something that we don't want to engage in now? And if the science leads you white space, then it can be a very brief discussion. Stop it for now. And that can be very useful in resource allocation, and it makes sense at the decision-making level, at the functional level, at the project team level, even to the bench. How do you pick your animal models? How do you design your trials when you have that clarity?
Makes sense.
Can I just ask, Matthias, just to confirm I understand it right? So, of course, when we are trying to figure out how to win, right? So we are building up this great company and we want to design how to win. Would this be the step one, this disease mapping you would advise to try to figure that out or try to come up with a good answer?
It's often one of the very first steps.
Yeah. Matthias, I have a question because you make it sound very simple. You say, strategy is just start with an objective and a goal, and then you figure out how to get the company from A to B. If it was that simple, I guess you wouldn't have a job. It isn't that simple, right? It's not easy for companies.
I think one of the big challenges is strategy is also about all the things you do not want to do, and even more so. That's one of the reasons why portfolio management even exists, right? If resources in terms of staff and money were infinite, then you could pursue every project and you would perhaps still ask yourself some questions of values, beliefs and goals, etc. But now that resources are unfortunately finite, they need to be matched with ideas for projects, which are of course also finite, but that number is usually larger than what can be resourced properly. So focusing on stopping certain projects that may have value, but a lower likelihood of arriving at a place where they deliver on the objectives. And identifying that early on is a really difficult task because it means stopping projects. It can mean closing departments. It can even mean shutting down entire therapeutic areas. And I've seen that in companies that update their strategy and realize some of the indications that we actually have a reputation in have developed such that a lot of the unmet medical needs are well covered. There's a lot of genericization in these indications, and winning with something novel has to overcome significant hurdles that may be higher than what the current understanding of science and technology allows you to aspire to.
That's a really good answer, Matthias. Companies might call you to ask for help on what to do, but you are spending a lot of time advising them what not to do.
Well, thinking of therapeutic area strategy, to pick just one for the moment, it is, of course, trying to understand the landscape for each of the indications in it very well. The option space can be huge. Then how do you take decisions of what not to pursue? Certain aspects of diseases that can be defined as disease biology may be easier to tackle, some may be harder to tackle. Some may lend themselves more to modalities that you have established as a company versus others lend themselves more to modalities that you do not have, that you would have to partner. So these parameters can inform the choice of how do you reduce the option space to something that's manageable. And that can typically lead still to a far too large number of indications that could be worth pursuing, and then you have to trim it down. It's a very intense process of excluding all the other indications that have merit to pursue, but maybe not by you.
Matthias, can I just follow up on this one a little bit, just out of curiosity? And that is, when you come into a company to help them do this, What do you find they usually struggle the most with? Is it that they didn't even start doing this exercise before, or is it that they just didn't do it in the right way, or is it that they actually define the focus area, but they then don't stick to it, and then they start to do other things? What is it that they mostly struggle with?
That's often the case. Maintaining the focus of what was picked as core activities is lost because that appreciation of following the science takes over, and this is still a great project, and let's keep it alive and let's take it to the next step. That can be a tricky thing. Yeah. Then also the stringency of the assessments for fair comparisons can sometimes be tricky. And then the other trick is, once you have a prioritization, how do you deal with it? In the end, it's supposed to inform resource allocation to reflect the priorities and to reflect the objective set for the company. And what we have often seen is that if you ask decision makers to come up with a pure black and white, continue the project or discontinue the project type decision, that can be hard because some projects do have merit. And as such, we have developed some 4 classes of priority. There will be projects that are top and have significant potential, and accelerating them or expanding them may make sense. So these would be the highest priority. The next priority would be those that are doing fine and are going pretty much according to plan. And then invariably in larger portfolios, there are projects that run into potential showstopper risks. And rather than stopping them right away, we suggest to resource these projects to the extent that the showstopper can be mitigated or confirmed. And if it's confirmed, it's a termination. And if it's not confirmed, then it can well go into one of the prior 2 categories. And then there are, of course, projects that should be stopped and everybody agrees to. And that doesn't mean drop everything right now, but it means resource controlled process to terminate and close the project.
It makes a lot of sense. And if I can continue into the world of portfolio, because you already said that you need the corporate strategy, you need the portfolio strategy, and we need the execution. So those are a few of your key pillars. You already alluded a little bit to it, how you would approach a portfolio review. If we had no clue how to do it, what would be your cheat sheet, or what should I start thinking about in a company to get my portfolio set up for value creation and have a best practice portfolio review process in your book?
There are a couple of ingredients to successful portfolio management. There's organization, processes, governance, decision-making. Now, about organizational parts, ideally there's a neutral reporting line or portfolio management reporting into a neutral function, CFO or CEO. Mm-hmm.
What do I mean by neutral?
Having neutral between the 2 distant constituencies of research, and on the one side and commercial on the other. Where, as we said before, the focus tends to be on different things. Having portfolio management report to research or to R&D will lead to different results than having it report to commercial. It is still possible. We've seen it work in certain companies, but if you want to avoid certain agency conflicts, then it's better to have it report into a neutral function, such as CEO or CFO. Then about the process, this can take up a lot of time. And in our experience, it's best organized by having both a regular annual portfolio management process where the season triggers the update of all the project reviews and the portfolio analysis. And that also allows ad hoc event-triggered review of individual projects and then assessment of what does that mean for the portfolio balance as a whole. And these events can be internal by virtue of clearing a certain milestone, completing a clinical trial or such, or they can be external, say the tentative future standard of care that you had on your list to compete with all of a sudden failed. That changes your landscape and your positioning and your forecasts completely. So that should also trigger an ad hoc update of a project review and what it means for the portfolio. That's so much for process. And then there's the governance decision making. In our experience, it's also a question of the balance in how power and empowerment is allocated. Yeah. What works very well, and many companies do that, they want to empower their project teams to a large extent, which requires for guardrails to be set very clearly. That can be in terms of budget, and that can be in terms of timeline. That can also be in terms of which indications are core and which ones are adjacent. So this is why the link back to such a direction setting can be very fruitful down to the individual project level. And then, of course, the awareness and appreciation of a balance of project level decision-making and portfolio level decision-making. Certain things can be and should be decided at the project level, but when it comes to the sister project that pursues the same indication or an adjacent indication, maybe that's more of a portfolio question than that the project team should not decide for themselves. So these are some of the key ingredients.
In your experience looking at how companies typically do portfolio reviews, is there something where there's often a weak link?
One of the things we spoke to already is having a prioritization, but not acting on it and not terminating projects or not allocating resources according to this prioritization, number one. Other things are methodologically, the big difference between early and late projects should be recognized and should be dealt with. And most companies have a major transition point in their R&D value chain. For some, that's IND, start of clinical trials. But for more companies, what I've seen, it's at proof of concept. So when an effect in the disease population in question has been demonstrated. And that goes along with two major changes. In the earlier part, you have significant risk of failure and limited data. Sometimes if it's a new target, you don't even know if you're ever going to validate that target. So you need to focus on different things. Whereas once you have the proof of concept and have confirmed the target is valid and it works in our proof of concept indication, that is a significant step of de-risking and provides a lot more information that can then be used to inform a lot of additional analysis. It should be much more quantitative in terms of what should the target product profile look like, what parameters must be met in terms of how do we generate data that support that clinical trial design investment in terms of TPP scenarios. In what shape and with what data package will we come out of pivotal trial and what will we submit? This will have significant impact on pricing, reimbursement, on positioning in the indications, treatment algorithm, etc. So a lot more quantitative analysis and market perspectives are due once you have passed that. And if the portfolio management approach doesn't reflect that, it can be a huge effort to try the same rigor and depth for earlier projects, because you're simply too far away from entering the market. You are lacking a lot of the information that you would require to inform all these scenarios.
That makes a lot of sense. If you then look at the portfolio teams in pharma, is there something maybe from an organizational or process point of view where you say, okay, this is a thing that portfolio teams often struggle with, or if they could just improve that part, they'd be better off?
Well, I think one of the tricky tasks is that a portfolio team would ideally have a lot of different backgrounds. So for the late stage portfolio, they need to have an understanding of how clinical trials are run, of the different steps that are happening, of the pricing, reimbursement, market access perspectives, the regulatory approach. So there's the technicalities to be understood. Then they also to be able to win the trust of the project teams to collect all the data that are important and relevant to informing the assessment. And then they also need to be able to handle the functions when it comes after the prioritization decisions have been taken. The resource allocation needs to happen. How does that guidance from the portfolio decision inform the resource allocation in the functions? And most importantly, they need to be able to make sense of all the analysis and put them into crisp charts and perspectives that are relevant to the decision makers. And also help them build a narrative around what the portfolio status is and what it has delivered, and how that can ideally link up to what we started out with the goals and strategy of the company. So portfolio management as a team has to walk all sorts of floors with the project teams, with the decision makers, with the functions, and sometimes with the business development licensing, because ideally the same methodology is applied to external opportunities during due diligence as to internal projects, because internal projects is what the licensing opportunities are the minute after the deal has been signed.
That's a really good answer. You can have a perfect strategy and almost perfect portfolio management process, but if you can't manage risk in the right way, you're in trouble. So what is your view or philosophy around risk and risk assessment in pharma?
But it's the big difference between pharmaceutical R&D and R&D in many other industries. You might always say in an industry where failure is the default outcome of R&D, which is the case in pharma, everyone has to be risk aware and risk conversant. And conversant requires a common language, a common terminology, and an approach to identifying, classifying, and then mitigating or tolerating the risk. And this is a really important thing. All of the above is not always a given. So for this reason, we have developed an expert system. We call it the R&D risk assessment over the past 20 years that we have worked on. And it really covers all the phases of R&D. It covers most of the modalities that are now available, and it comes in a set of some 500 questions, etc. And these are not just questions like a checklist. They also come with what's a poor, what's a good, what's a reasonable, what's a very good outcome for this particular question. And so it's structured in risk classes, which also enable this common language, common terminology thinking. So there are conceptual, infrastructure, non-clinical, clinical, CMC, and regulatory risks covered. And this is along the R&D process and covers all the steps that a molecule would undergo in terms of science, technology, pharmacology, clinical manufacturing, regulatory, etc. And this has proven quite helpful because it allows for comparison of risks between projects.
Sometimes teams tend to think risk assessment can be done maybe in an afternoon, and you mentioned it's 500 attributes to really do it in the right way. So let's say I'm about to put my molecule into big phase 3 program and I call you. How would it actually look if you were to assess it together?
We would provide the project team with a set of questions, and the project leader or manager would probably divide up these questions by function represented in the team so that everybody would have to deal with a set of 40, maximum 80 or 100 questions by discipline. And these are not outlandish questions that they never thought about. This is their daily bread and butter that they have been working with all along on that very project. And most questions can be answered very easily from documents that the project team members are working with day in, day out anyway. And if there is one that they haven't heard, then they find it quickly. So it can actually be done very quickly. And then we've built a software around that handles the pure administration of all this. And then the neat thing about it is it allows you to compare project one with another project.
If there's a listener out there in a company saying, I want to get started on risk assessment, what is the easy way to get started? You mentioned about being conversant, about having a common language and talking about it. What's the next step?
To start simple is, again, a language terminology. It starts with a distinction of day-to-day operative risks that every project encounters versus critical risks that may comprise stopping the show, that are often referred to. And that's already an important first step. And then if you want to go to a more rigorous approach of R&D risk management, and here I've primarily been talking about this science and technology, so the true R&D risks. The next step could be, how can you engage different functions, all of whom encounter different risks, to communicate to other functions of why a certain finding is particularly tricky in the project. So the identification, the mitigation across function that's often needed should be covered by whatever system is used in order to allow a fair comparison, but also in order to be a foundation for joint mitigation of risk. Because it's not just about identifying it, pointing the finger and saying, oh, this project has a risk. Really, every project does, but what can you do about it? And for some things, putting time, money, and resources at it will do. Organizations, small and large, have to give answers to their investors, their stakeholders, their shareholders. And given that R&D risk is so high and most projects unfortunately fail, risk is bound to be part of this communication. And what I find relevant about it is it permeates the whole goal setting on top down to the project level work. So if you asked me to put the structure of the risk of a project into a single chart, I would pick a decision tree. You're all familiar with that. You have binary outcomes of your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, etc. You can fail at each step, you can fail at filing, etc. So that reflects on the clinical risks. Oftentimes, what is the probability of success given, but that's of course the inverse of the risk. Now then, after launching, you may end up in different market environments that are more or less conducive to positioning your drug, and you may have completed your clinical trials. with your base TPP, with an optimistic or with a pessimistic TPP. So all of this can be shown in this one figure, and all of this speaks to risk and allows you to explain why a certain market scenario that you were entertaining a while ago all of a sudden doesn't come to pass, or conversely, why all of a sudden the assumptions and the data are different, and hence the commercial value and the financial value of the project, which can make up the late stage pipeline, can make up a significant proportion of the financial valuation of a company. So that's where this is relevant. Next, it's relevant at the project and at the portfolio level, because the scenarios you create around an individual project can be modeled, simulated in a Monte Carlo fashion at the portfolio level. And then you arrive at a way of explaining risk that may or may not match your appetite for risk that you have formulated in the first place. If you set out to address unmet medical need and crack the hard nuts, then maybe you have been more risk accepting than if you set feasibility rules and we will only pursue best-in-class opportunities. So this is where you come full circle when reporting.
That's really great practical advice. So the advice to the teams is start having a shared language, start drawing decision trees and try to plot your probabilities on it. You can always take more steps to aggregate at portfolio level and do more advanced Monte Carlo simulations. It just get started and then build from there.
Absolutely. You can get ever more fancy, but it starts with the simple assumptions.
So Matthias, you have worked with many companies over the years and with many different levels of decision makers, from board of directors, the CEOs, the heads of R&D, finance, all different departments. What is your view on decision making in the biopharma industry? Is there something general we should pay more attention to if we want to improve the decision-making quality?
This may sound generic, but it's a fairly general piece of advice. It starts with minding the difference between a good decision and the right decision. Whether a decision was right or not, you will only know with hindsight if you have bet on the right horse, so to say. But a good decision is one that makes use of the best information available at the time and putting that information in the best possible context and use the best and most appropriate analysis on that information. And then they have to do what the name implies. They have to make decisions based on less than perfect information. That can make decisions so much more productive, rather than putting a lot of energy into whose assumption or view or belief or speculation is right. Come up with rational scenarios that you can argue and assess which one of the scenarios is more or less likely, all the time knowing which one is more desirable, but that's usually obvious.
Even though the answer sounds simple, I think it's very often a simple answer that is the most powerful, and this one definitely is. But I think you also indicated a little bit towards the next question, that is, what is your own decision-making style? On the spectrum from pure gut feeling to pure analysis, where would you place yourself?
Well, many in the pharma industry and in the consulting industry, of course, entertain a strong belief that humans can be rational decision makers. I have let go of that, which doesn't mean that you should throw reasoning and, in fact, basis overboard. Quite on the contrary. The best decisions I think I have taken and the best ways I have seen decisions being taken by others is when you, number one, set yourself a reasonable time by which you want to take the decision, and then work towards collecting, taking and understanding, analyzing the best available information in the most complete data set, then assess scenarios, desirable, less desirable ones, and what their drivers are. And then comes the important step. When you've essentially saturated your reasoning apparatus with all this, let it sit, sleep on it, and then allow the brain to listen to the gut. So in that way, I think, and I've seen it work a couple of times, it then is often referred to as, that was what my intuition told me. Yes, but you fed your intuition with a lot of facts and good reasoning before, but then you may have arrived at a decision that the pure reasoning would have not taken you to.
Really well said, I think.
And also very powerful. I see it very often that people try to seek all the possible answers, and then they either get to a position where they don't end up making a decision because they always want to get the next answer, or they have they found out so many things that they actually are not able to make a decision because they don't know what to choose.
Also known as analysis paralysis. You can do so many analyses, and also here, thinking in scenarios is very powerful say, a project level. But then I would advise not to use simulation at the project level. Simulation can make sense at the portfolio level, where the complexity is greater, but only if you have prepared proper scenarios at the project level.
I have seen many slides where there was a lot of scenario analysis where you end up with 100 scenarios, but you don't know what to do.
It's not helpful, at least for most of the human decision makers I've seen.
No, but that's a great advice, and I think you have given a lot of advice. Matthias, what would be your number one piece of advice for R&D leaders that work with strategy and R&D portfolios in their daily lives?
I may sound repetitive, but it's really about the objective, the goal, and then the strategy. And again, it sounds so easy, the disease mapping exercise. Some of our clients have disease map bullseyes in their meeting rooms, because it's not just about identifying indications, it's building an organization, developing an organization around it for the next 5, maybe 10 years. And that's not just what are the research and development projects engaged in. It's also about what resources, what partnerships, what networks of key opinion leaders, of prescribers, of patient advocacy do we have around these core indications. Are we really the best company or one of the best companies to even work on these indications by how we are set up? That's the guidance that comes with it. And that can inform the partnerships you pick, which departments you grow, which ones you don't grow, etc. This can inform what additional modalities do we want to have access to. So this is where it comes together. And that would be, simply speaking, my advice. What to mind in a rigorous exercise every 5 to 7 years, but then also what to remind yourself of on a daily basis.
I think that's very nicely put and very actionable. What would be your number one piece of advice for the finance leaders in the industry?
Well, I would suggest develop an understanding of and find yourself a trusted expert who can help you. If you, as a finance leader, you often don't have the science or technical background. And if you don't, then find yourself somebody who has it, understands the R&D hurdles with regards to science, technology, clinical, COC, regulatory, etc. What are really the crucial hurdles? And why is that? Because finance is, of course, mostly quantitative. It's all numbers, right? And all these numbers look the same. But if these numbers and these analysis done to the numbers are sound, what still differs is the reliability of the underlying assumptions at the basis. And these are typically qualitative. So at some point, qualitative scientific observation is translated into a number. And that number is wrangled and handled and put to all sorts of analysis to arrive at the ENPV of a project. And if there's a faulty link anywhere in the chain of assumptions, that conversion can blow the sales forecast or financial valuation grossly out of proportion in this way or that way. And even worse if there are several weak or faulty links. So that would be my suggestion, especially in an industry where R&D is at the forefront of science and technology.
Oh, and again, that's very nicely put. I think it's something that should be repeated is if you are a finance person in the industry, it's not about another formula in Excel you learn. You should learn more about the thing you are actually looking at. It's not about the financial model.
Put yourself in a position to challenge some fundamental assumptions. What would have to be true for this forecast to be credible?
We have other guests advocating that R&D and commercial folks should speak more together. And of course, you would not be against that. But here you almost say that the R&D folks and the finance folks should actually start having more lunches together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, sorry to beat that drum again. This disease mapping exercise and what you arrive at is really a process that can lead to that handshake of commercial accepting, not knowing every detail of what the guys in discovery and research are doing, knowing full well that while they follow the science, they will make sure that some of the science will tackle the projects, the indications at the core of the bullseye.
Matthias, we're coming towards the end and it's been a really insightful conversation. Is there something you feel we have not touched upon that you want to mention?
Well, it's perhaps this theme that biopharma R&D has always been at the forefront of science, and science is a global endeavor of people around the world. And that is reflected in the industry, the interdisciplinarity, the cosmopolitic teams, different departments working together and talking to each other. And well, even the language may even be different between a molecular biologist and a biochemist, but they have an easier time establishing a common language. And the further away the disciplines are from each other, the more challenging it can be to develop that language. But seeing that and being recognized I find an inspiring perspective.
How do you actually see the industry as a whole? Are you optimistic or worried? There's so much uncertainty.
I'm a glass half full person by nature, and that's also my look at pharmaceutical R&D. Had you 20 years ago, I was skeptical about cell and gene therapy. Now it's there. And now I think we're seeing a huge acceleration with novel modalities, with novel technologies, and the combination of biotechnology with data science, machine learning, and AI. And that's going to take us forward. Can all of this also be put to a bad use? Yes, of course. But I think the industry and societies can turn it for the better.
Yeah, but I think that's a quite optimistic outlook. So what are you up to in the year ahead?
Well, simply speaking, it's developing the Catenion team, working with existing clients, winning new clients. We have been working for the past 21 years with clients around the world. We literally have clients in Far East, Japan, China, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, in Europe and in the US. And there's a significant development in biotechnology happening in the Middle East. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have set themselves the goal of establishing a biotech hub of global significance by 2030, which is around the corner. 2040 was also mentioned at one point, and there's a huge momentum there, which is great to see.
A geography we don't hear mentioned as often as the US or EU or China, so that's quite interesting. Can I ask, we always ask our guests what they've been reading lately, so I don't know if you have any advice.
In fact, related book that I've also given out is a present for various occasions last year and to various people is titled The Coming Wave, Mustafa Suleyman. It establishes a containment problem, the task of maintaining control over powerful technologies such as biology and biotechnology applied to it, and machine learning and AI, especially when pairing the two. And he likens the potential of these technologies per se, but especially in combination to the use and the risk of abuse of nuclear energy, and suggests that regulation is needed and containment of undesired developments needs to be discussed at a global level.
Seems with a book with a lot of food for thought, so that's added to my reading list. I'm intrigued. I will look it up right after our chat here. And then I just have one fun question. When I go to Catenion, going over the team members here, then when I hover over the profile pictures, those very business professional pictures switch to something where it looks like what people are doing in their spare time. Some people are climbing and some are dancing or making music. And in your case, you are not in suit, but on a beach in Bermuda shorts.
Yeah, that's me after sunset on the beach in Crete, which is where I spend a lot of the summers. I quite like water sports. I like the beach and I like it warm. So I felt like that was a good illustration. Everybody on the team has their private side. In the team that we have been lucky to build over the past years, we have more than 20 nationalities. We speak more than 25 languages as a team, and as the mouse over images demonstrate, there are no clones. All of us characters.
There's probably some early career people or senior career people there thinking about a job in consulting. So how would you describe the Catenion culture?
We're composed of life science and data science people, only most of them with a PhD, coming from universities around the globe, as reflected in these many nationalities. And they all somehow found their way to Berlin and to Catenion, wanting to make use of what science and technology they learned in their studies and in their PhD, and at the same time wanting to work where is it applied and put to use that they can subscribe to the development of drugs. And while everybody comes with their own particular background, their own particular spike where they have their depth, they all come with one ingredient that's important, and that's the wanting to work together as a team. And that in a way reflects a little bit what the biopharma industry is like as a global industry, a very international, very interdisciplinary.
And how should our listeners get in touch with you, Matthias? Is there a preferred way?
Most easily through email, krings@catenion.com, or through my LinkedIn profile.
We'll make sure to link also to the Catenion website and everything we discussed.
Absolutely, yeah. There's plenty of material there.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for having you join the podcast today. Have a great day.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss some of the things that my colleagues and I do for a living. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Stay in touch.
Thank you.
Okay, Martin, this was our conversation with Matthias Krings. What is the practical advice you take away from this episode?
Before I jump into that, right, and then I can give you one my piece, I think now putting all the things to perspective is Matthias was another reminder that it's the simple things done well. And I don't think he said anything that was out of the world, super crazy that no one heard before. It was, again, the smallest things. That's where you can really create value. It's about defining what your ambitions are, what the goal is, and a strategy line to that, and sticking to the strategy. And I think, of course, that was one of the takeaways. But I think what really struck me in this regard also was that as a finance person working in a public company, if you look across public companies, they all say our goal is to maximize the shareholder value. And I think, as he said, okay, that's our strategy, that's what we want to achieve. But then you see it very often that those companies get swayed by quarterly earnings and so on. Is that necessarily good for the shareholders? No. But it's still done because that's how it's done in public companies. If you don't define well what you want to do, and if you don't stick to it, you will end up making decisions that not create enough value. They destroy value. Then again, that's a simple takeaway. That's the simplest you can do, but it's so powerful.
I agree. I would add to that sometimes it requires that you get the outsider in, and that's also part of people like Matthias's job. It's easier to see things clearly when you come from the outside into an organization, because we can become blind when we work inside the same buildings with the same people every day. So I think that's another practical advice, whether it's hiring consultants or some other people you can get to take a look at what you are doing and where you are going. I think that's also very practical to have a set of fresh eyes and perspectives.
Just one practical thing here, because I think you have a great point. Sometimes it's just even a new person joining the team that all of a sudden brings a new idea. It's often very helpful. What I try to do is that sometimes it's just about, if you're trying to solve something, go and see how another company is doing it. I mean, they're always happy to share. And then all of a sudden you can figure something out that you would never be able to do.
Yeah. One statement that struck me and I keep returning to is his remark around portfolio management needs a neutral reporting line, either finance or some other, what you would call neutral. Because if you put a reporting line into R&D or commercial, you get different results. Or at least there are different models. It can work in various companies, but maybe it's more likely you run into trouble if you have a commercial reporting line or an R&D reporting line. And I think that's quite interesting. And that also speaks to the fact that at portfolio level, there's a lot at stake that impacts the enterprise, because the portfolio is very close to the overall strategic capital allocation in a company. That was an interesting point that apparently he has seen examples where it didn't work out optimally. So I think that stuck with me. And then, of course, the risk assessment and his 500 questions. Our listeners might think, 500 questions, that would kill my team. But I think we didn't discuss the specifics of the questions, but I can only imagine that the questions would be very simple for the asset team to answer, because it is the simple questions. Were there any red flags in your tox package? Is the molecule soluble? What about in vivo models? Did you demonstrate effect, and how translatable? They will be easy to answer. So I think 500 questions shouldn't scare people away. And we have to remember to do risk assessment well ahead of your big decisions, whether going into phase 3 or other big investment decisions. You need to spend a few full days minimum to do it well. And it's time well spent, because you're committing the organization for a long time once you pull the trigger on that for the project.
It's very much the same as a flight attendant or a pilot just before they take off, right? They go through this list of, do you have this on? Do you have this on? It can sound extensive, but like a pipeline asset, you don't want to commit the organization to $1 billion risk without really doing your homework. So maybe 500 questions sounds a lot, but it's also huge decisions.
And if you're 10 people, you're already down to 50 questions each. You can split it further. So I don't think it's an overwhelming task. It doesn't have to be. It's good to have a structured approach. And back to the simple things done well. You could start, draw a decision tree, discuss probability of success, and then some other day you can think about more fancy tools like Monte Carlo simulations and so on.
Sometimes it's as simple as just finding a friend in a different function so you can learn more about how to create value in general. Maybe that's where we can close it. Please go find a friend in a different function, and then one day you might end up doing a podcast together like me and Simon.
Yeah, and please let us know how it goes. I think that's a beautiful closing remark, Martin. So thank you for listening, and please check out our page on LinkedIn. Just search for Cures and Capital Podcast and leave a comment in the discussions that we try to stimulate there.
Thank you for listening. And we have many guests lined up, but if there's someone specific you would like us to bring on, please let us know. We would love to hear the inspiration.
Martin and I, we want this podcast as something we co-create with you as listeners. So until next time, take care.